I am so excited that we are into season 3 of my podcast, Stories of Unconscious Bias. When I first began this podcast, I had no idea that it would take off. I began it because I genuinely want more people to listen, reflect, and learn about how our life experiences can influence us in ways that we cannot begin to imagine. Due to the wonderful candid stories my speakers have shared, I now know that my podcast is ranked in the top 5% globally. I want to thank all my speakers for this huge achievement. As always, if you enjoy it, please do share, rate, and review. Thank you for listening. Welcome, everyone. I'm speaking to William Dalrymple on Stories of Unconscious Bias today. William Dalrymple is a Scottish historian and writer, art historian and curator, as well as a broadcaster and critic. His books have won numerous awards and prizes, including the Duff Cooper Memorial Prize, the Thomas Cook Travel Book Award, the Sunday Times Young British Writer of the Year Award, the Hemingway, the Kapuściński, and the Wolfson Prize. He is also one of the co-founders and co-directors of the annual Jaipur Literary Festival. Welcome, William, and thank you so much for joining me. So, William, unconscious bias, what do you understand by those two words?
It's a phrase I've only recently come across, to be honest. Once you log on to it, you suddenly notice it everywhere else. But if you'd asked me a year ago, I think I would not have heard of it at all. But obviously, I would understand it to mean the set of preconceptions which you hold, many of which probably were inculcated to you in childhood and in the course of your education, which have remained lodged somewhere in your subconscious, reflecting your interaction with the world ever since.
Yes, exactly right. And it just doesn't have to be just childhood. It could be all kinds of different experiences. What kind of stories are you thinking when you think of childhood and unconscious biases?
Well, by any modern standards, but particularly by modern literary cosmopolitan standards, in other words, by the standards of the world I now inhabit, my childhood was really quite astonishingly backwards, conservative, religious, and pre-modern, actually, which wasn't to say that it wasn't an extremely happy childhood and a childhood brought up in a very clear moral framework. Which at that point I assumed was the only moral framework and the only way of looking at the world. But I think I have made a longer journey than many, because the world I inhabited as a child still had people living being brought up by governors. I was born into a home that was aristocratic, highly Catholic, entirely and completely white, although my family had generations of interaction with India, including and I have Indian Bengali blood, but none of that at all, not even the glimmer of it had made any impression on my childhood. There was no sign of India at any point. There are colonial houses full of elephants' legs and things lying around Britain. Mine was not one of them. And it was a world which, in many ways, was very unchanged from the sort of world that Edwardians or Victorians would have grown up in, with the one exception that my family had moved out of the big house, which had been theirs for 10 generations. So in addition to that whole layer of very white, aristocratic, well-to-do, monocultural childhood, there was also the element of my parents' fervent Catholicism. My uncle was a priest. Both my parents were not just believing Catholics, but something close to fundamentalists, and I was brought up very much with that whole world around me, and the kind of demons in society were people I was taught who were divorced. Divorcees were kind of close to vampires in the kind of hierarchy of horrors out there in my childhood, and I suspect most British people, when they would be admitting unconscious bias, would probably end up talking about race. Race didn't even come into my childhood. I didn't know no one who wasn't Caucasian, white, and probably Scottish. And my first trip to London at the age of 7 to go and see the Tutankhamun exhibition, I was a mad keen archaeologist and fanatical about history even at that stage, was this sort of eye-opening moment when I came across a city where, I remember coming out of the British Museum and seeing for the first time people, this is early 70s, seeing Harry Krishna musicians in the street playing tablas and dancing around. And I remember being I mean, I just never seen anything like it. And it was every bit as astonishing to me as the exhibition I'd just seen.
Fascinating. I mean,
My preconceptions were those of a vanished world today. I mean, you have to go very far to the boondocks to find anyone who still.
And of course, you didn't know that.
Unconscious biases I had as a growing up, and I then went to a Catholic monastic public school that was again almost entirely white, and being in the middle of the North Yorkshire moors, I mean, presumably deliberately placed there away from all possible temptation, which included any variety of the feminine, which was almost completely absent from my life, in that I came from an all-male household, other than my poor mum. I had 3 brothers and the father who very much dominated. They then sent to an all-male prep school and public school. You'd have to go quite a long way to find someone, I think, that was brought up with so many.
I mean, it's completely fascinating. Because I just want to summarize the different unconscious bias. See, because as you very rightly said, your childhood, your upbringing is what it is. But if you think about what you've just described, you've talked about class because of socioeconomic and status. You've talked about patriarchy. You've talked about race, as in white and non-white. And all of these 3 experiences were your normal. And you didn't even, obviously, why? And you've talked about religion. What am I saying? 4 things. And all were perfectly, completely normal.
Yeah. And on top of that, as I say, very serious level of religious preconceptions, which were very much at the forefront of my conscious world growing up.
So do you have a story? I mean, when you sort of, you had left home, left school, perhaps, even finished university, you're not like, let's say you're 25. I'm fast forwarding you from the Tutankhamun at the age of 7 to say age 25, give or take. And how are you now? Because you're probably in London. I'm making it up. I have no idea. But how do you start then reflecting and recognizing? Have you had any particular experience that gave you the realization?
It's very clear and very strong. And I can give you the date. It's sort of branded into my consciousness. It's the 26th of January, which, as you know, happens to be Republic Day, 1984, when through a series of accidents and no planning at all, I ended up going with a friend and arrived in January 26th, 1984, having really seen very little of the world in between. I'd spent no time in London. I had only probably been to the south, as in anywhere south of North Yorkshire Moors, where my boarding school was, a few times. And southern England was pretty exotic to me. And then from that was dropped into the vortex of India, which was it could have been a different planet. There was almost nothing which linked it to the world I'd known before that. And it was, there are cliches of people talking about things being a life-changing experience. Or this was a genuinely and completely and permanently life-altering experience.
Sounds like it.
Still, now I was 18 then, and I'm now 54. I do the math.
Exactly.
And it was as dramatically different a world as could be imagined, but I loved it pretty well instantly. And it was the most exciting, life-changing, eye-opening, jaw-dropping few months of my life. And as I say, it sort of formed everything that's followed.
I really want to understand this concept of unconscious bias. So your narrative, your story, you come from this, this privileged, deeply religious, entirely white, and then you come into an environment, and we both know what that could look like as, January 26, 1994 would be seared in your brain. And of course, unconscious bias can be positive or negative. And it clearly for you fell in love with the country. But what kind of assumptions may you have had, or not, I don't know, that once you arrived, you were looking and you kept getting surprised, because that's when we realized that we had biases and actually those stereotypical expectations were not right. Did you have anything like that?
Yes, I mean, in almost every conceivable aspect of my experience in those 9 months. exploded the preconceptions of the previous 18 years. As I said, so work through that list that we made earlier of patriarchy, white,
all of that,
aristocratic, racial, and everything. So, I mean, obviously, racially, I was in a world where I looked different from everyone else, and yet, one came across instantly common humanity and all that binds us, and an odd feeling that this was. I felt very early on, very at home, which is I still feel, and it's a. I always wonder whether it turned out to have a Bengali great-great-grandmother who I knew nothing about. And I always wonder whether that's part of it, whether there's some DNA in there that chimed with this. But so I suppose, race, women, I'd never really been in a society where there'd been anyone other around. And suddenly all of the femininity of India in all its glory all around me. In terms of religion, probably most dramatically, I'd been in a world where there'd been, it wasn't just a Christian world, it was very specifically a Catholic world. And that contained its own universe. I remember talking to, when I went to Nagaland recently, they were talking there about how all the different villages had been at war with each other, and they were all like frogs stuck in an individual well, thinking that their well was all that there was. And I said, I know exactly what that feels like. That's the world I came from.
What an analogy.
And it was in many ways, I had grown up with one particular form of Christianity, but in every bus journey I made, in every restaurant I sat down to eat a dosa in, there were Hindus, Muslims, Jains, Sikhs, and all that brought with it. And India is, a living lesson against dogmatism.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you see colonization, or how you saw colonization, how you see it today? Because 0 to, let's call it 18, with all the different examples that you've already given to us, and what your unconscious expectation would have been. And then, of course, today, what that looks like. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So 1984, to remind you, was, I suppose, the year after Richard Attenborough's Gandhi, and was the year of the Jewel and the Crown. And so there was an awful lot of India on the television, but it was very much Imperial India. It was the Raj. And I remember, and I mean, it seems a joke now, but I remember going and thinking the place to go and get clothes for India was the Army and Navy store in Edinburgh. I went out and got a khaki shirt and a pair of, I'm not joking, I got a pair of khaki shorts. I'm literally true. Because I thought that presumably is where everyone wore it. And my father had been, as you'll know from my writing, that generations of my family had been at, because we were exactly the class which filled the imperial hierarchy. We were not the top rank of super toffs who never went out because it was always too dangerous, but we were exactly the kind of level which was sufficiently well connected to get a place with the East India Company or in the Raj Civil Service, but desperate enough economically to need to send the younger sons out. Most of whom never came back. Most of whom died there. From the very first ever built discovery, who was a guy called Stair Dalrymple, who ended up in the Black Hole of Calcutta in 1756. So generations had been there one after another, and like almost all the Brits probably all the Brits who I'd ever met, it was assumed that colonization was an act of bringing civilization to poor benighted natives. Although even at that stage, both The Jewel and the Crown and Richard Attenborough's Gandhi, both of which are very now very dated films, but both of them, however, did very much contain the idea that the British could be brutal, and that there was a great deal of racial injustice. So those sort of ideas would have been present too. And my family, oddly enough, having all the biases I described earlier, were not right-wing. My father was a liberal. So I think from the very first awareness of colonialism, there was two ideas at war. One was that this was an act, a civilizing mission, but also that it was one carried out probably brutally. And to aid that idea, I was Scottish. And we are brought up with the whole story of what the English did and the struggles for freedom and the wars of independence that we had. And on top of which, my nanny, who was very central to my upbringing, was Irish and a sort of sort of Fenian revolutionary who quietly read me story. I mean, I remember at the age of 7 being taken to the library in North Berwick, the small town I grew up, and being read tales of the Irish potato famine and pictures of women eating their babies because the English took the food. So I was very au fait with the idea that the English could do
The
terrible
English
things.
were the villains, weren't they, William?
But I was a Scot, so
That's exactly it. So when you were growing up, there's one more unconscious bias when you were 7 or 8. It's not just the patriarchy and the aristocracy, it's also the English. I mean, the
the
English
English
were
was
the
a
bad
huge
guys.
part of it. And I actually remember I remember
That's very interesting. I mean, how many people would listen to your voice right now with this all English accent? And obviously people will see your photograph when I promote the podcast. So you see this white guy with this all English accent, and he's saying, when I was 7 years old, I thought the English were really bad people. I mean, I'm paraphrasing what you've just
not
said,
just that.
but
I
that's
mean,
amazing.
I very, very clearly remember my first trip to England, which must have been when I was about 6. I mean, we lived in the borders. It wasn't far away. It was, it was an hour and a half drive. So it wasn't like it was the other side of the world, but it was an hour and a half away to the south, and it was England, and the English lived there. And the English I already knew were the redcoats, and they chased Bonnie Prince Charlie from the battlefield of Culloden and hunted him down cruelly and raped the Highlands. I mean, there's an awful lot of Scottish nationalism in my childhood education. And this first visit, it happened to be during crop burning. So when we crossed the border, all the fields were on fire. And I thought I was entering Mordor, there was sort of smoke rising from the fields. And I was expecting to see sort of corpses lying in hedgerows and bodies hanging from gibbets. And that's again, I mean, like the story of the khaki shorts from the Army and Navy store is, it's semi. I mean, it sounds like I'm making it up, but I can promise you, it's entirely true.
And that's the thing, you see, and that's what happens with our unconscious bias, because we have no idea that we are making all these stories up in our head. And why are we making up these stories? It's because of the narrative of our experiences and who has said what and what we've and because you had, and this is a new gem that you've kind of thrown into the mix, because in amongst all the other stuff that you had, you also had this wonderful Irish nanny who was also pivotal to influencing you. So, I mean, fantastic.
She really was actually incredibly important, and she loved history and read a lot first to me, and then I suppose with me, or guided in my reading. And she planted early the seed, which has grown into books like The Anarchy now, I suppose, of being really suspicious of what the redcoats would be up to, and to kind of assume that they were cruel and horrible. And yet my father, was very much a pillar of the establishment, sort of honor at Sandhurst, all that sort of thing. And so there were those two very different ideas coexisting from an early age. It's taken, I suppose, the journey towards the anarchy where, without unequivocally, the British are the villains, and the East India Company has virtually no ameliorating qualities at all. It's been a long journey. Anyway, but I mean, it's been fascinating for me, and I hope that I've taken my readership with me.
Well, I'm sure you have. I mean, and for those of you who have no idea what William means, is that The Anarchy is his most latest book. So you have a connection to India. We've already established that. You have a home in India. You spend more time in India than you do anywhere else in the world. Can you tell us a little bit about that and unconscious biases in relation to that? You have children, you have a family, you have a white family, I've got to specify that. What does that then look like in terms of unconscious biases? Have you experienced any positive or negative unconscious biases from another regard, or from your own children or your wife? Just some stories you can share?
Well, I think the world continues to move on from generation to generation, and the discoveries and insights of one generation are soon superseded by that of another. And having university and post-university age children, you rapidly realize how ideas change. I mean, we've been having a lot of discussion in the family over the last couple of weeks about the whole generation divide over the question of transgender and J.K. Rowling's response in general. The generation of my children find J.K. Rowling's position to be totally untenable and unreasonable and hypocritical, while my generation tend to wonder slightly what all the fuss is about. That clearly there are biologically speaking two genders, and in that simple statement lies a whole generation's worth of preconception and division. My kids are very, very clear that what Rowling said was wrong and reprehensible.
And of course, you've got Black Lives Matter, which has taken over the world, rightly so. Finally.
Black Lives Matter.
What kind of family conversations do you have about that?
That is less central in the sense that we're all between Britain and India. So our discussions are much more about, in the sense, the pogroms in Delhi against Muslims, who in many ways are the blacks of India, and the likely victims of police brutality. As I don't live in the United States or in urban Britain for more than a couple of months a year, the struggle for equality of the civil rights movement in America and so on is more foreign to my experience.
And so it is really about the fact that one or the other, it doesn't matter where you're looking, whether the fact that there is people who are the haves and the have-nots. It doesn't matter whether it's India or the United Kingdom or the United States or anywhere else. That's what you're saying. And it's about accepting that, and recognizing that.
The kind of biases faced by Black people in the United States are very similar to the kind of biases faced by Dalits or Muslims in India. And they're the last to get the jobs. They're the first to get locked up or stopped by the police or beaten up by the police. So in a sense, we're seeing that struggle at one remove. And
that's actually a very important point that you just made, William, because again, people who do not know you and you're hearing you and listening to you right now on this podcast will make assumptions just based on your accent and based on what they hear and what they read in my introduction about you. Whereas obviously all of us are so many other things that people don't even see or understand or recognize. But I mean, all these different experiences that you've had, William, you've obviously been reflecting and thinking and so on and trying to, sort of challenge perhaps your own unconscious biases. How do you do that?
It's something that each person has to wrestle with in their own experiences and out of their own lives. And the things that have changed my views of the world are not ones which are, tips that you can give somebody else. I mean, what changed my life was going to India and being a journalist and covering the Kashmir conflict and
but what about? But hold on, sorry to
risings in Delhi and the Mundal riots and all that kind of thing. I mean, those were the things, in a sense, which formed me. My kids went to the British school in Delhi, which was, certainly a privileged environment, but it was as multicultural, as multi-religious, and as mixed in gender as you could imagine. I made a great point of making sure they never went to any school which was male only, or in the case of my daughter, which was female only. They always had mixed education. So of course they will have any number of biases, and it may be for their children to correct them, and it will be.
No, but I mean, I think certainly one thing that perhaps you may not see as a top tip, but I certainly do, is about open, honest conversations with the family, which is what you did, which you were talking about just a minute earlier about J.K. Rowling and the whole idea about transgender and how do they see it and how do you see it. And obviously you would have only had that conversation because you as a family were able to sit together and chat openly and explore and discuss.
I mean, the big tip I would offer, although, is travel. We are all, to some extent, I mean, very few people are quite as much frogs in the wells as me and my Naga friend. But we are all, to a certain extent. We grow up in our own little wells, and we think that well is the entire universe, the cosmos. But in fact, there are many other very similar wells near us, and travel is a way of seeing that that each well is different, and that other wells are often more attractive and or have different things to offer, and different pros and different cons. And I think it is the best way to remove certainly a great swathe of preconceptions is to travel and to spend time in other cultures and to see how other people live and how other people work and love and live their lives.
And it doesn't have to come because you have money. We can do it in a very small budget if you chose to. Of course, nobody can travel right now because of COVID, but hopefully when things are calmer, of course, I think that's wonderful. I mean, you're so right, because travel, going to places that you've never been to, opens your eyes and gives us a learning an experience, an exposure that most people cannot get without actually being in that place.
There's no question. I mean, it changed me comprehensively and totally and completely. I would be a completely, utterly different person if I'd never been to India. It's that simple.
January 26, 1984.
It's the hinge around which my life has swung. Definitely, no question.
Oh, that's wonderful. William Dalrymple, thank you so very much for sharing your stories of unconscious bias with all of us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to my podcast, Stories of Unconscious Bias. If you enjoyed hearing this episode, do tune in every Saturday for a new interview. And if you could share, leave a review and rating, that would be hugely appreciated. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter @Smita Tharoor, and feel free to suggest new guests. Until next week.